Hello, friends. This is John Finnegan, and I'm here today with the CEO of Green Valor Capital, Erik Evans. Erik, you and I just met each other literally weeks ago, but we have really formed a friendship and have gotten to know each other. And I think this is a great opportunity for you and I to take a deeper dive. And so, could we do that by starting? Where are you from originally?
Colorado.
Okay, so you grew up in Colorado, but you went away for a period of time. It actually led me to
Repeatedly,
believe, yeah,
several times actually.
yeah,
I
and you came
escape and
back,
then I get lured back.
yeah. So, what did you study when you were in school, and what dreams did you have then when you started down this path?
So coming out of Cherry Creek High School here in Colorado, I ended up, you have a limited subset of academic pursuits that are available to you, I think, growing up in a particular region. People in New York get exposure to certain things, people in Florida, people in Paris. And in Colorado, you see a little bit of the outdoors, you have the outdoor lifestyle that kind of buoys a lot of elements of your kind of your personality. But they also teach a lot on the science side. So coming out of high school, I had a fairly strong background on the sciences, had done a lot of medical research just in and around town at
Hmm.
that point in time. So I had a career path slated towards something more science medicine related when I went off to Georgetown in DC, seeking a degree in biophysics initially. I mean, when you're a freshman, you really don't know exactly what you want to do. You're throwing a dart, and I do remember not really being ready or prepared for college from the perspective of it wasn't a planned next step for me. I mean, I think it was a default coming out of the fact that I wasn't drafted into the major leagues on the baseball side. And there was that now what do I do kind of moment coming out of high school where you're saying, I actually have to go through a career path. And I guess I get told that this college thing is fairly relevant in taking that next step. So you kind of pick a direction, you pick a school, and you go. And when I ended up landing in DC, liked the area, loved the school and what it looks like, but there were like a few things that I found about Georgetown that were kind of turnoffs, and for me anyway. And certainly one of them was the very strong focus on political science. The pull to get me into that program at university was the diversity and breadth of students studying all kinds of things from all over the world, and I bought into that. And I think that it was very appealing to me. The kind of Indiana Jones of universities, kind of centered in the nation's capital. But when you get there, the reality is most of the people are there to become the next president of the United States. And whether they started in the business school because it was easier to get into than the political science school, and they were trying to find a way to navigate and negotiate to get into the political science program, you could already see the machinations of some of the wheelers and dealers trying to game the system to get into politics. And just kind of that overall crowd was a bit of a turnoff to me, particularly pursuing something that was non-political in sciences. So I ended up getting involved in neuroscience research out there, how the auditory cortex process sounds, and worked at both the Georgetown Center for Cognitive and Computational Sciences as well as NIH with some of the researchers that were there. Did some pretty interesting work in that freshman year. But I think overall, the conclusion I drew for myself was if I was going to go in that direction, I wanted to go somewhere that um, yeah, probably had a little bit from an undergraduate perspective more robust science program. And so I ended up transferring back to the University of Colorado going into my sophomore year to study physics at, in Boulder, in large part because they'd had several Nobel Prize winners in both physics and chemistry that were a little bit more, had created a little more defined program, and probably what I view as a top three program on the sciences nationally. So I ended up going up there, getting involved in that, But also when I was at Georgetown, kind of my side interest was, where I spent my fun time was doing planning for like concerts and events through their programming board. So when I went back, I really enjoyed that process of bringing like Big Head Todd and the Monsters, Violent Femmes, and kind of other concerts to Georgetown. And so when I went back to University of Colorado, I was looking for something similar and ended up getting pulled into their student government, student union, more on the finance side. There was availability and opening on their finance board. And I was like, well, this isn't quite like as cool and as exciting as bringing, artists and musicians to campus, but it's kind of a foot in the door. And as I ended up spending 3 years on that board and ended up ultimately leading the board, and kind of going into the final year. And it was a good experience. And I think I got visibility, insight in finance, budgeting, planning, kind of how the world of finance works in government planning and kind of academic planning, and a little bit tilting towards business planning, because as I continued on the academic side in sciences and math, I got involved with kind of starting up this student entertainment fashion magazine at the time. It was something that the students modeled in, photographed in, wrote articles in, and ultimately got sponsored a little bit by the university, but then by outside vendors and companies in the Boulder community that would kind of donate the clothes to be able to run ads for their boutique shop or something like that. And it was this entrepreneurial kind of business media experience where we produced a physical magazine back then. And coming out of that experience, I learned a few things. Like, one, students didn't read a whole lot, and two, that content format, even in the late 90s, was dying. Like there was clearly this need to kind of move into a digital realm, and I was like, really, you're gonna have to go more of like a video format, kind of like MTV for music videos, to kind of quickly capture people's attention. And this was pre YouTube, or probably even YouTube ideation at that point. But it kind of opened my eyes to, if you were going to continue down in the media journalism and entertainment path, having some videography experience and going in that more of that film direction would be the path that journals and magazines kind of evolved into in my lifetime. And so I ended up applying to some business programs, applying to some like science programs, and I applied to USC Film School coming out of undergrad, and thought, there's a very low probability that I'll get into their film program right now. But I had a passion for film. I really enjoyed it. Really enjoyed watching them. Really enjoyed the whole kind of experience of films, and got in. And I think kind of that entrepreneurial experience, trying to drive something from nothing at the university was probably the thing that opened that door. And I ended up going out there, and then the big fist of LA kind of like smacked me in the face from day one. It was definitely a tough experience in the LA. I don't think the university or the program necessarily were very, necessarily difficult, but the life in LA and kind of getting established, getting settled, all the things outside of academia were very difficult in a city like that. And I think the cost of an area like LA, particularly back in 2000. I mean, it was probably equivalent at that time to San Francisco, New York, and it was one of the. I'd say they were all kind of on par with one another at that point in time. Today, they're probably a little bit at a discount from a real estate and cost of living perspective.
It
But
seems like you came of age at the dawn of the internet, and you took your early the early part of your life to experiment with different career choices.
often, and often to the detriment of, like, I mean, it's one of those things that if you're on the West Coast, if you're kind of in a more entrepreneurial startup community, that's appreciated, particularly pre tech telecom downturn. that was kind of the mantra, is go experience all kinds of things, go study abroad, go experience life, and then you'll find your career will find you, and you'll get to do what you kind of want to do, and you'll be able to like start a business doing something no one ever thought of, that your experiences kind of led to. And I'd say that was in fact the way of the people that, if you were of the right age, like a Jeff Bezos or an Elon Musk that came up with PayPal or Amazon, and you were at the age that you could launch a company
Mm.
during those booming years in the 90s, a year or two after the internet got established in 92, 93. I mean, so if you look at when Amazon, eBay, Google, all those companies ended up launching PayPal, it was really within like a 3-year window, between like 95 and 98 effectively. And there's been very few, I think, tech companies that have, I mean, tech people are going to disagree, but like had the kind of mark that those did. I mean, Facebook, obviously, Airbnb, there have been companies since then, but when you look at the real transformational tech companies that kind of ran up out of nowhere, Yahoo, the Googles, they definitely spawned from a very narrow time frame where you're not only growing up in that era, but you're really like the completely appropriate age where you've got some life experience, but you're not so entrenched in a career that you're committed to that career. And so I think people that were 30 to probably 10 years older than me were really in that core area of their life and career during that internet, the coming of the internet, and being able to be a little bit better. I was probably on the tail end where if things would have continued economically without that '01 downturn, that tail would have been longer. And I think some of the innovation ideas would have persisted a little bit longer. But kind of where I was going with it, the idea of that philosophy of kind of just go experience life, try a few different things, like find a direction and move forward. Coming out of '01 and that downturn, that was definitely not the advice given to people coming, moving on from there. It was very much a conservative pullback of focus specialization. Do a degree in accounting, get an MBA in finance, go into a career path, go into marketing, get a side job in sales, do internet, digital sales. And I'd say that only worsened coming out of '08, '09, where then when we had the financial downturn, and just 7 years later, 6 years later, kind of depending on, but
Did
the
you complete,
focus.
forgive me for interrupting, but did you
uh,
complete your undergraduate degree and then go to Los Angeles and
right.
work in the film
Yeah.
industry?
Yeah, I finished my undergrad getting degrees in physics, math, and then a minor in philosophy, and then I went, and you look back, and I certainly look back and say I just didn't really know what I was doing, to be completely honest. Like if I would have known, if I would have had that Zuckerberg gene in my head of like, this is my time, like at 18, 19, I can't be thinking about school. I
Right.
can't be thinking about like passing and getting great grades, or like focused on, free academic research that I'm spending my time doing as opposed to getting paid and starting a $1 billion company. I just didn't have that probably mind frame of, I mean, certainly had an entrepreneurial mind frame, but it wasn't really a capitalist entrepreneurial mind frame
Right.
of like, I got to make money out of this. I mean,
Right.
a lot of what I spent time doing undergrad was, the student board, that was free. The concerts, event promotion work, that was free work. The medical research, by and large, was free work. It was for credit or something like that, if at best, and a lot of it was just straight up free. But I just didn't have that gene of like, I need to be monetizing my efforts at 18, 19 years old and finding a way to like create a business out of this, like some people did that kind of earlier on in their life. A Bill Gates, a Zuckerberg, that just from like 18 on, that was their drive and focus, was to kind of make money, do something that made money. And so I don't think I really had that same motivation, at least at that point in time, and kind of understanding, because of that kind of that moment in time. It was like, yeah, you don't need money will come. you find
Follow your
something you
passion.
love, and something like that. Yeah. And it, like, great things will happen.
Hmm.
And the whole philosophy of, if you do something you love, you'll never have it work a day of your life. And it's like, well, that would be nice, and then there's real life, and a lot of it requires, like, at least spending a portion of it doing things that you may not love. And when I saw the type of student that came out of that '08 downturn, the kind of that true middle of the road millennial, um, there was a level of focus. I mean, those people were told about the apocalypse that occurred while they were in school,
Yeah,
kind of in '08, '09, 2010, 2011. And the
right.
people that came out of there were so laser focused on, like, getting an internship sophomore year, junior year, in a career path, a viable career path, like really taking their hopes, dreams, and goals and right sizing them to the economic realities of the time, which are like, so you want to start your own fashion line? It's like, how does a degree in accounting and a career in audit sound? It was really finding a practical path forward. So when you look at the kind of the radical shift, just even that during that time frame of, the world is your oyster '90s mind frame, to a very practical, focused, career oriented, from 20 years old on perspective, that people, I think, coming out of '01 and then the '08 downturn even worse. And you'll probably see the same thing coming out of this little economic snafu here, where people that were starting to get a little more creative and find passions and pursue them, you'll see people kind of rotating back potentially into a little more conservative, at least, entry points.
So
Um,
when you spent that year in the film industry, did you come back to Colorado? Did you go
no,
back to school,
I
or did
was
you
I was
take a
hook,
job?
line, and sinker into the Hollywood. I was whole Hollywoodified. So once you get to Hollywood, you kind of get into that world. You think that there is no other world. The
Yeah.
the rest of the world is a failure. If like, your only chance of happiness and success are if you do it in Hollywood. And
Yeah.
there's this brainwashing process of, you're no longer referred to as a human. You're an artist.
Yeah.
You are an artist, and you're like, by God, I am an artist. I mean, whether
Yeah.
you are or not is
Yeah.
up for debate. But you
Well,
know,
and you and I are going to have to, fingers crossed, in 2021, the Telluride Film Festival is resurrected. It is truly an industry focused film festival, and would love to see you
that
join
was a
me
good
there.
plug. That was a good
Yeah.
plug.
I, I
South by
I have
Southwest.
had more fun in the last 8 years at the Telluride Film Festival as a volunteer, and
I
it's
mean,
it's even
I'm
more
with
fun
you.
than buying a ticket. To be a volunteer, I'll never be a Hollywood insider, but I am to the extent that I volunteer for that film festival, and so yeah, I that is a plug for you.
Well, we'll have to we'll
Join me.
have to get down there, because
Yeah.
one of our marketing people is down there this weekend, and I've never been to Telluride, and as a Coloradan, this is their or Crested Butte, and I'm sure this is shameful that the locals are taking back their Colorado native credit, as a result of my lack of diversity. I've been many places, just not those two. But
Eric, Labor Day weekend 2021, it's on your calendar, okay? Pencil it
all
in.
right, I like it. Labor Day
Okay.
week. That gives us a lot of time, right? I mean, at least things should be better by that point in time. So is that when the
Okay.
leaves are turning and everything?
Say it again.
Is that when the leaves are turning?
Oh, it's just you never know. I mean, it can be 90 degrees
Hmm.
depending upon the weekend, depending upon the year. And given our climate change, it might be 90 degrees
Yeah.
Labor Day weekend in Telluride next year. But so wait a minute. Now the way you described it is Hollywood sort of spits you out after a year.
Well, it's more, you get into that world where you're thinking, this is all that I care about.
Yes.
This is what I want to be. I want to be, a filmmaker. I want to be an artist. They do a very good job brainwashing you, and it is cool. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, it's really a fun potential career path.
Yeah.
I ran out of money I had to take out student loans, and you burn through those with a lot of the production costs, school costs, just overall cost of living, the frequent parking tickets you get as you're going around the city and having to like go places to shoot. And man, their meter maids that is a career path in and of itself there, where they do quite well for themselves,
Yeah.
and to the detriment of all the other people that end up paying. And they aren't like $20 tickets. They were really expensive parking tickets. So like you just kind of get under the city kind of starts pulling you down. And I feel that in certain big cities, that one in particular, because there isn't much in the way of public transportation, you really, you have to drive. There's obviously, everyone talks about commuting in LA. It is the worst anywhere that I've ever been. And I think it's a real challenge to ultimately like get ahead in that kind of area. So I ended up getting a job at Paramount Pictures, an internship, paid internship on the business side, doing motion picture business development work and budgets planning, kind of working on the production side, because I was broke. Like
Yeah.
I had no money to spend. And
And you're doing
so
that today with helping students because of
that
the
I am.
experience that you had.
They're benefiting, and they don't even have to be graduates. They're undergraduates that are benefiting from paid compensation. And
Yeah.
so I think that the experience was good, but I also saw myself from a realistic perspective as you start peeling back the layers of Hollywood. And these are kind of the warnings that I give people that look at going down that career path and going into Hollywood, is they give this perception that like here in Hollywood, anyone can make it. And and you have historical examples of that, like Marilyn Monroe and other people,
Sure.
Brad Pitt.
Hmm.
But the reality, once you get there and you start peeling back the layers of like, well, who are the producers, who are the studio executives, who are the cameramen, who are the supporting actors, there is a level of nepotism there that is just profound. I think every industry has a degree of nepotism, whether you're in oil and
Hmm.
gas or banking or
Sure.
tech. But that industry in particular is so strong, and it is very much about who you know versus kind of what you know, or even how much money you have in that environment. You can be a oil baron, and it still is a kind of an impenetrable market to get into. But once I kind of saw how the game was played, I was like, well, this is a real long shot. I mean, this is the 1 in a million Hail Mary pass, if to be able to get into actually doing this for a career, and being the next kind of Spielberg or person, somewhere in that arena where you're being able to kind of create your own films to even a minimal degree, and write and direct, or what now would be a Christopher Nolan or something like that. And I just sat there and did the odds, and I was like, I don't like these odds. Obviously some people, that's what they roll the dice. I saw myself realistically being more on the business side, so I ended up getting a full-time job down in Orange County because I needed a break from Hollywood, and I liked the Orange County area. I felt like the further you got away from the epicenter of Hollywood, a little more breathability and kind of livability crept into the equation. And when I got down into Orange County, and I mean, certainly by the time you get to San Diego, it's lovely. But a lot of the problems that just like day-to-day issues of parking and, getting around town and having affordable food and things like that kind of got mitigated once we got into Orange County. So I ended up going down there and working at a company in Orange for a little over a year, just as a regular old finance guy, finance
Okay.
analyst.
Good. Now
And
you're in the working
I
world.
wasn't ready to go home.
Yeah.
I wasn't ready to give up on the dream, but I was ready to be realistic that before spending another 2 years and going, another $120,000 in debt,
Yeah.
finishing that program for a degree that potentially didn't really yield a job like a Harvard law degree would.
Yeah.
I needed to pause before I sat there and went down that. So I took a year, did the business, and was like, I'm not going to say this is exciting as film, but I talked to a lot of other people that had been in film. There was a woman that I worked with, Karen McFadden, that had been in Hollywood her whole career, and she was in her, I think, early 40s, maybe late 30s, early 40s, somewhere in there. And it was a hard life. It had been a hard life for her, and she had friends, family, kind of like in and around town, had been in the industry, and she was on the production side, and she finally had like quit and pulled herself out of it and just taken her first like normal job ever after 20 years like doing film, and had to effectively restart a career from scratch.
Right.
And you could just, I mean, we compared notes on, was your experience like this? And she was like, absolutely. She's like, it just eats you up. And again, if you're the lucky one that gets kind of elevated into a position where you're making good money and you're not kind of having to scrape along, it's not a bad career path. But I think for everyone else that has the normal job, the blue collar jobs in
Right.
film production and TV production, it's a tough life. I mean, you go file for unemployment in between gigs, you struggle to find the next job, you cross your fingers. Sometimes things work out and sometimes they don't. And I think certainly as you age out in that industry, and for people that's pretty young age, I mean, for most people talk about it and complain about it all the time, particularly like females, of like how the next 20-year-old gets all the jobs. And even as you go into your 30s, the options get limited for Reese Witherspoon or something, and she has to go start her own production company, write her own
Right.
material, cast herself in these roles because no one else is casting her at her late 30s, 40s. And I mean, that's someone that's incredibly successful and incredibly talented. So you can imagine for like just the normal actress, like how very quickly they let you in your 20s and how easily they let you go. And I'd say for guys, it's probably, there's a delay in that factor where you probably don't get in as quickly, and accordingly, you're kind of held on to maybe into your 40s or something like that before it starts getting more challenging.
Hey, Eric, before we leave California in your story, I want to give a shout out and a big thank you to Professor Jack Buffington at DU, who's working hard to build a supply chain management program for that school. He's in charge of plant logistics for Miller Coors, and his student Neve Healy was my intern, now yours, and how we met. And I just want to give a big thank you to both of them because it gave me the opportunity to meet you. So,
It gave us the opportunity to reconnect because we had actually known
oh,
as
yeah, that's
hung
true.
out at ACS,
And we have mutual
about
friends
fundraising.
from the American Cancer Society, Sean Meyerhofer, Patrick Gaines, etc. So, yeah. So
Yep.
now you've done that year in finance. Where did you go next?
And that's where I, sat down at one of the, you know, Orange County outdoor malls at one of the restaurants, and I got my big placemat that was paper and mapped out different career paths and the time it was going to take to get there. If I went back and got a law degree, if I went back in the science and medical arena and went back and got my MCAT and kind of went down that direction. If I got an MBA and kind of stayed on this business track, do you do it in LA? Do you do it in Southern California? Were there good reasons to do it there since I was sitting there? Or do you go back to a place like Denver that still was at that point in time? I mean, this was, right around '01, was still a pretty high flying tech telecom, internet champion. So Colorado was a pretty good spot to be too at that point. And so I really just had to assess like the timelines, how long it was going to take to kind of get down these different paths, how much I would enjoy different things. And I kind of concluded that law, even though it kind of opened some doors, I just don't know very many happy lawyers to this day. Behind it all, I don't know what it is about that career path, but it's a relatively rough one unless you kind of go the corporate law side. But
Right.
if you're a practicing lawyer out there, it is. I just don't know very many happy ones, and you can make a lot of money for sure, but
Mhm.
it was a longer path. It was one that I wasn't particularly, parts of it looked appealing, but the path of returning to medicine was probably a very, very high interest of mine. I mean, I really liked that, but it's just the academic path to do it and the time it takes, and the fact that I would have probably been more interested in the research like I'd been doing, which then requires an MD and a PhD,
Right.
and you're just in school forever. And at that point, they weren't. I don't know what they do exactly today. I know they kind of shifted away, but back then you would have to pay for your MD and they would scholarship your PhD, and you just would, but you'd get stuck as you're going through the entire program and residency and specialization with the accruing debt on the medical degree side of things. So by the time you were ready to actually start practicing or having a real job, you're in your like early 30s and you've got just a gargantuan amount of debt that you're having to pay off, and that thought was a little unattractive. And I think they realized that, so a lot of the medical schools started, if allowing people that got into that dual MD PhD program, they would scholarship the whole thing. And I don't know if they've kept it up like that as time has gone on, but at least when I was exploring it, that was the path. And I was like, this is just economically and from a time perspective and a career perspective, it was a tough one to go down. So that kind of just left the MBA, and I was like, I don't mind this business thing. I think that it opens a lot of different doors and career paths. It's a bit more of a general life business kind of degree, and it only takes 2 years, and you can do it part time. So I
Right.
ended up exploring part time programs and concluded that there wasn't like, for what I wanted to do, there wasn't that strong of a motivation to keep me in LA. It so I ended up going back to Denver, getting a job more on the telecom side of things at Quest and then Sprint Nextel, and doing my evening MBA at DU, focusing more on the finance side. And that kind of is, things evolved on the career front where the roles that I got put into within those organizations just happened to, they could have gone into marketing, they could have gone more IT-ish, they just happened to go more finance.
Right.
And so that supported kind of the path that I figured I was going down. So I ended up doing that, and when I finished, I mean, there really aren't terribly exciting stories behind that. It was kind of, you just put your head down. Quest was, it was a few months after Nashio got pulled out and indicted, and they brought in Notabart, and there was this whole recovery cleanup effort that was going on, but it was a struggle. I mean, you could definitely tell they were not particularly well positioned for technologically what was actually transpiring in their industry, the shift away from landlines into the wireless realm. They'd kind of doubled down on things like long distance in their landlines, particularly with Anschitz's acquisition of US West, and the fact that US West is primarily a land-based type of service versus going and buying a wireless type of company. And they had a wireless arm, but it was not the forte. And as things continued on at Quest, you could just tell, like, they were in a tough spot because you had one guy that owned both the debt and the equity of that company with Anschutz.
Right.
So where they were actually at, the correct thing for a business person to do would have been to file bankruptcy and effectively wipe out the equity ownership and restructure the debt, and then they could have moved forward. But because the same person owned both, they didn't want to do that, and you had to kind of find a way. Basically, they just hobbled along until some fool purchased it. It
Yeah.
was greater fool theory, and obviously they were shopping it pretty much from day one, but no one bid even at significant discounts because of the amount of debt that had been brought into the business with the acquisition of US West. So you could see people that had been lifetimers. You could see people that were relatively new to the business, like myself. The potential that a Quest offered from a career path and kind of maybe their existing career path that they'd spent 20 years, 30 years in, and the fact that it was clearly like going away. That industry as a whole was evolving, and it was evolving out of Denver. So I ended up shifting over to Nextel, and within like 3 months, Nextel announced their merger with Sprint. So then, things got a little interesting on that side as they went through that process. But, I'd say overall, this was just like you have a day job, it's on the telecom side, you go to classes at night. And things didn't really get interesting until I got through with that, when it's like, okay, now what do you do? And I, looked around town, and there were a couple, known entities at that time, like First Data Corp and Western Union, a couple other, romping grounds. But there weren't a lot of great jobs that came my way, that out of those companies. And I mean, there were some, but they just weren't great jobs. It was basically doing kind of the same level stuff that I was doing before. And the one opportunity that was the outlier was going into a smaller business that they had two arms. One was a digital advertising agency, and they had a sister company that was an online music store. And they were super small. I mean, I think they were doing, the year I joined, they had just finished maybe under 5 million in total combined sales between the two companies, which pretty big shift from like 35 billion in sales over at the other company. And it was, the number of employees, I think they had 35 employees at the one company versus, probably that many thousand at Sprint Nextel. So it was a really big shift, downsizing and being the only finance accounting person there. But it ended up putting the entire onus and responsibility of, transitioning accounting systems and bringing them up to speed and getting visibility and doing a lot of strategic planning and doing it at a company where it mattered, where I just wasn't a cog that could get replaced as easily. And you actually had input. You have a lot fewer resources, obviously, but it felt kind of good having a lot more autonomy and kind of control over the overall business. And generally speaking, I made some pretty decent decisions, particularly in hindsight, of like they just were the right calls. And it led to significant growth of that company in the capacity. I mean, one person isn't going to change everything themselves, but I think the goal was providing the visibility to allow other people to see where the obvious challenges economically were within their system. And
Right.
then we could kind of collectively, once we had transparency, we could be like, this is how we need to fix this, and everyone could nod. And then you put together plans of how do we go about fixing it. And a lot of that is sales, marketing, business development type of activities where you're generating additional top line revenue. But it's how do we win new business? How do we expand? How do we get growth capital and to grow our business from external entities? And so there was an interesting process there to get them to the next level. And I think that we got there, and that experience really led to parlayed into getting involved with a company that did that type of work. But you weren't doing it for just like one company, you were doing it for multiple companies. So you're moving into a consulting model where you were doing it for a number of different firms. So I did that with Colorado CFO Group, and moved over there like right before the '08 downturn. I think I moved over in like April of '08. And the first 6 months there were great because, again, there were a lot of businesses seeking kind of strategic and financial guidance. And once you got into the economic malaise coming in September, October of that year, a lot of the growth and opportunities disappeared. So, and instead of helping companies grow, you were helping them survive. So I guess it's elements of that are similar to what we're going through now for certain companies, but still not a fun economy. And I think that Colorado, that had generally been weakened by the loss of a lot of telecom and tech jobs in the '01 downturn, once you got to that second round in the '08, Colorado really, in my mind, struggled to recover. I mean, New York got hit hard early on in the '08 financial crisis, but they recovered quickly.
Yes.
Places like Texas never went into it. They didn't experience a downturn. I mean, other markets that they had a hiccup, but they kind of rebounded. Colorado really struggled, I think, up until probably like 2013 when they passed that marijuana law. and all of a sudden, whether you like it or don't like it, not a political or philosophical debate, but that
Had an impact.
provided an economic lifeline or jolt
Right.
that really the Colorado Denver community needed to jumpstart other traditional industries, construction, real estate, oil and gas had always stayed, it had stayed decent, but the Denver market hadn't exactly grown like wildfire during the downturn either. I think other markets, Permian Basin, Texas, outside of Pennsylvania, North Dakota, had seen a lot of growth, but not necessarily a lot in Colorado. With the kind of overall growth of Denver coming out of that 2013 2014, I do think a lot of oil and gas companies, Anadarko, some of the ones that relocated to the new kind of Union Station area downtown, as that came back to life and things, the momentum got met. You started to see more oil and gas players looking back at Denver, or putting offices here as other parts of the economy started catching momentum.
Right.
And I think that honestly kind of continued up through this latest hiccup. I It's a little hard to tell how deep this recession is going to be for Colorado and for some of the other markets. Obviously, services, tourism, travel are pretty significant components of Colorado's overall economy. Oil and gas hasn't been doing well, and some of those companies that did grow in that energy arena are stressed and not doing well right now.
Yeah.
So you're looking at a number of core industries of Colorado that are getting negatively impacted, services, but at the same point in time, it just doesn't feel the same as those other two, where it was a really direct economic downturn and economic related pullback. This feels more like a health related pullback, kind of a situational thing that just is impacting people economically. And once you solve for the health issue, the underlying economy that's there seems like it's going to be okay. But obviously a big part of that is the government stepped in early on with stimulus measures for large and small businesses. And I think for the most part, the large business measures were so significant, whether that's the PMCCF or the SMCCF, that they put in place to kind of provide liquidity to the credit markets for these large organizations. The mere existence of those facilities and the backing of the federal government by $750 billion did enough to kind of buoy the public markets and the large cap companies. For small businesses, the PPP did a pretty good job early on stabilizing businesses and allowing kind of keep the wheels on. I mean, obviously, every person in Congress, Democrat and Republican, here or in DC or in New York or in California, know that those companies continue to struggle. And so I think that, putting in place a second measure would be beneficial, and everyone kind of knows that and kind of agrees on that, but there hasn't been any movement. So
Yeah. Right.
until there's cash flow coming into those small businesses in these other communities, I think a lot of them are just starting to kind of shudder. I mean, some of them shuttered fairly early on, but certainly moving forward, they're going to be in a distressed position where it may make more sense for a lot of the business owners to just go out of business and then restart and kind of cut their losses now, retain some capital, and wait until things recover, and then enter back in and do the exact same business under another business name and same ownership, but not without the lease obligations and maybe some of the debt that they may be carrying right now. I suspect that there's going to be a fair amount of like workout restructuring type of programs, that policies, processes that a lot of these small companies here and elsewhere are going to go through to survive.
Eric, you had some other experiences. You came back to Colorado. You went back to school, worked for Quest. got that entrepreneurial experience working for that small company, but then you also spent time outside the state of Colorado. Talk about those if you would, please.
Yeah, so it was really that 2008 downturn and being on the CFO consulting side in this community during that time where there was work is just it certainly wasn't what I signed on for, which was helping companies grow
Right.
and kind of get to the next level. And without a robust local economy and kind of credit and availability of capital to support the businesses, there just really was not anything growth. It was hobbling along in 2010, 2011. So during that time, I went back to get yet another degree from the University of Denver, a Master of Accountancy, so that I could get this CPA, because
Yeah.
during those downturns, you cut sales and marketing people in the front end because there's no sales. You cut finance people because there's no sales. Why do you need to budget and plan if there's no growth?
Right.
But you still need to keep the accounting folks and the auditors. And so during downturns, having a CPA is rather nice. So
Mm-hmm.
I ended up going back and doing that at night while I was, doing the CFO consulting for small businesses. And when I got through, I did not focus a lot on taking a role in the Denver market. I looked long and hard at Dallas and New York and did most of my recruiting in those two, which at a distance was challenging, but not impossible.
Mm-hmm.
And I ended up getting offers in both. The better offers, in my opinion, were in Dallas, and I took one of the roles down there. Ended up moving at the end of 2011
Right.
down into that market at a fintech called Market that later on ended up going public and then merged with IHS, which was in Greenwood Village. And they did effectively a bit of a reverse merger where IHS took up Market's global headquarters in London. And that's kind of where that business is based today.
Yes.
But at the time, I was in their Dallas office, which was a pretty big one. It was the biggest domestic office for Market, not necessarily their big sales office, but it was their big operational
Mm-hmm.
office. And that was where I started getting involved with the client base of that company were primarily asset management firms, financial service firms that either used Market as a fund admin or some kind of for their fund accounting purposes. And we ended up selling an accounting software package that I was effectively product manager for, and was responsible for like sales goals and changing the product and providing customer support and figuring out what was going wrong with just basically being the product owner manager. And in doing that, you kind of work with other product managers to come up with new products that you can kind of cross market and sell. And you know really the biggest thing for me was learning this world that I wasn't terribly privy towards, or no, I certainly didn't know a lot about, which was private equity, hedge funds, some real estate funds, but just overall the fund realm of asset management and how the legal structures got set up, how they, operationally got off the ground, what compliance elements they needed, what regulatory issues they ran into, what they invested in. You kind of had visibility into all of it in a company like that, where you're seeing everyone's different portfolios and platforms and underlying investments. And what you really saw was everyone invested in the same stuff. There was definitely a lot of co-investment between investment managers and investment funds, and they kind of syndicated the risk out to their entire community, and particularly like certain niches or little groups of investment partners that different asset management firms kind of they would run in similar circles. And that experience, and I was a big fan of Dallas. I was a big fan of Texas, which probably doesn't give me a lot of credit in New York and Denver, but I really liked the area. And I just found that doing what I was doing, no one understood what I did in that market in the same way they really wouldn't in Colorado either.
Right.
It was so bespoke that being in that asset management financial services realm, it just didn't parlay well to transitioning into something, more traditional finance at American Airlines or Southwest Airlines or Dr. Pepper Snapple or something that was in that market that, would have been a logical transition point. It was hard to kind of see the linear progression there. The more obvious progression was going to New York, and that was kind of where that role led me. Right, joined Deloitte in the beginning of 2014, and it was initially more on their. They had a similar group that did the effectively similar types of work, product services for that asset management realm. So there was an obvious appeal to that group. And as time progressed and availabilities and other engagements surfaced, I ended up doing more on the M&A advisory side of things, of due diligence, like pre-acquisition due diligence, post-acquisition integrations, and kind of felt that part of the reason was the experiences I had at Colorado CFO Group doing that for smaller businesses translated pretty easily into doing it for larger businesses and kind of larger acquisitions that companies, the Deloitte clients went through. So I did that, and that experience ultimately kind of led to moving over into Citigroup and getting real banking experience on that side and the institutional side. And I started more on the controllership, regulatory reporting side of things, ended up transitioning some of their workflow from New York down into one of their satellite offices in Tampa. It's kind of similar to how IHS Markit had their Dallas office that was a big operations center. Citigroup has a couple locations outside of New York that have housed the majority of their internal overhead operations, compliance, risk type of functions. And so I ended up moving down to Tampa, and that was an experience where I had never been to Tampa, but I had learned previously that when asked by the company, how do you feel about relocating to Tampa, Florida with the company? There's a right answer and a wrong answer. The right answer is, I can't imagine a better place on the planet. I would love to be in Tampa, tomorrow if possible. And the wrong answer is questioning and not giving the right answer. And so you learn to say, yes, sir. And I will be on that plane right away, sir. And so I ended up going down to Tampa, checking it out, and being pleasantly surprised at what I found. I was worried that it was going to be horrific, and it was absolutely lovely. And I vacation there every time I can. So it's an area that is part of the reason that we have offices and facilities there now is I just want to be there. I have a lot of old friends that are in the city. Yeah, it's a great area. I just absolutely love it. I'm a fan of other parts of Florida. I realize that Floridians and Texans are the craziest people on the planet. And anytime you hear a story of there was a whole series on when they once had a KS 107.5 morning show with Larry, Kathy, and Kendall, and they would always note they had a series of the dumb stuff that happens, or stupid people. It might have just been stupid people, and 9 times out of 10 it was coming out of Florida. The one time out of 10 it wasn't Florida, it was Texas. Man tries to wrestle alligator at restaurant and dies. Literally, that was one of the stories. And I think that one might have been Texas instead of Florida. But nevertheless, these were true stories. And so I get that the craziest people in this country are probably located in those two states, but they're also very large states with large populations. I'll attribute some of it to that. There's a lot of sun, heat stroke. Who knows what goes, melting of brain matter. Something's going on down there. But the areas are nice, and I enjoyed the experience. And when I kind of got to the end of transitioning to workflow, I said, how would you like to stay working down in Tampa? I said, I'd really be happy with that. They say, well, would you do it for like a 50% pay cut? I said, New York's looking pretty good right now. So I ended up moving back up to New York and took a role in their asset management practice of what was left of their once glorious asset management arm that Vikram Pandit effectively had brought in with his old lane assets. And I'm guessing, I think it was '07. And then he became less than a year into his tenure at Citi, he became the CEO, I think November, December of 2007, which, like if you're promoted into a CEO job, that is like the most ominous time that like what is that, 9 months before the biggest financial collapse in since the Great Depression, maybe even on some metrics bigger than the Great Depression. And so his assets, these asset management components, there was a really diverse grouping of alternative investments. There were real estate funds. Obviously, those didn't perform amazingly well during a real estate, downturn. There were hedge funds that you go in, and there were assets in there that were triple levered type of derivatives, which is like adding fuel to on top of fire. That when performing well, they go up a lot. When not performing well, they lose you a tremendous amount of money overnight.
Right.
They had private equity investments, a good amount of those, and market values decline on those as the broader market declines, but overall more stable investment. And they had some VC investments. So those were kind of the four alternative types of investments that they managed over time. And when I got hold of it, it was mostly private equity. I mean, there were a few VC investments. There were some real estate holdings. Pretty much all the hedge funds had gotten removed and sold off prior to me, and their 100 billion plus portfolio had shrunk to about probably a little over 3 billion when I first stepped in, and it went up and down. But that role was, again, some of those experiences from IHS Markit and Deloitte really opened up that opportunity, because pretty much anyone else associated with asset management at Citigroup had left. Mm-hmm. And anyone, and if you were good at asset management, you probably were not moving over from Goldman Sachs to oversee this Citigroup's remaining portfolio, knowing that there was kind of a wind down perception and progression that was taking place there. So I ended up getting in there, and I reported up to the guy that initially was managing those investments until he left. Right. And then ended up kind of by default running the assets for a period of time and until I left. And but it gave me broader exposure and quite a bit more confidence just to be able to work with other portfolio managers that were involved with the investments, the underlying operational executives at these companies, having a portfolio of companies that were diversely, from an industry perspective and geographic perspective, scattered throughout the world, whether it was Korean chicken wing franchise restaurants or Israeli software government contract tech companies, right? With Department of Defense ties. There were some like really, really interesting investments that you were able to be involved with and, go through the transaction and deal process with. They kind of just, it's, you need the exposure. And I think those experiences really gave me the confidence to say, well, here I'm doing it at these big companies. Right. I'd had a vision when I moved out to New York that, there was a gap, in New York. If you're a small business, whether it's a laser hair removal center with 2 offices, or, I laughed at like Juice Generation. That's a juice shop, has like 6 locations in the city, and they're all like private equity backed. Everything in that city is private equity backed. Everything Manhattan. If you're outside of the city, maybe not, but accessing capital, very easy for small businesses in that market. Colorado, not Dallas, so much. Tampa, very hard, very, very hard. there just are not the level of resources. And I think that my time in New York, I was able to, I mean, when you see the inside workings of these worlds, you're able to conclude why that is.
Right.
The economics didn't make sense for professionals in that community to do smaller deals. The talent didn't really migrate from New York to Denver and Dallas that had that skill set. And kind of accordingly, just the flow of funds are, if you're a rich person in California or Texas or Florida, you give your money to your Morgan Stanley broker or financial advisor, wealth manager. He takes it and invests in BlackRock, Blackstone, Apollo, sitting in New York, and the money all kind of flows to New York. So they've got a lot of capital to deploy, and they're always looking for investment opportunities.
Right.
So there was this arbitrage opportunity that I think exists today for me and for anyone, but it's just no one has ever taken it. I mean, pretty much no one has ever done anything about it,
Right.
because this is just the way the world works. So, that was the opportunity I saw, where small businesses in these other markets are fundamentally unaddressed. They've got no one to provide capital support to them. So, and certainly investment firms and investors in and around the New York area have no aversion to investing in those type of companies. There's some people that specialize in it, but they just don't have the resources and ability to look at every deal and every company going across the country. But if brought those opportunities, and they would have the opportunity to participate in them and deploy capital to these other markets that they don't necessarily have visibility offices or resources in those markets to be able to deal source and spend time on these type of investments. That really is kind of where I ended up directing a lot of my attention when I moved back to Colorado at the end of 2017, was one, just keeping the wheels on, doing the day job at Citi, and then two, building up the kind of next steps business plan for this Green Valor Capital, give it a go.
Right.
And started doing that in 2019 full time, and really, is went really well right up until COVID. I'll just say that, like COVID is definitely one of those moments that, it's a lot harder to source deals when you can't go to events and happy hours and conferences and meet with people, and you're having to do more of this. Like it happens. It just happens in a much slower, different manner. And again, you just have a lot of hesitancy from people as to what are next steps. And when you have apprehension, you have people that are being more conservative, saying, "Yeah, I was thinking of moving before, or buying a second home," and now they kind of shore up their assets and just they wait and see. So I think that there's been a lot of wait and seeing. I think that a
Yeah.
handful of investors have looked at this as an opportunistic buying spree. So those are people that we're partnering with that are, they're like, we can buy things for a lot cheaper today than we could have 9 months ago.
Right.
So they're out there looking. But then you have to find business owners in a position where they're willing to take less than they would have 9 months ago, either to support ongoing existence of their business, or if they are growing, where they feel comfortable accepting capital to support that growth, but maybe not in quite as favorable terms as they would have gotten at the beginning of the year.
I think it's important, though, that someone who would hire you to help them fund their business would want to know how you got here, the educational foundation that you laid early in your life. It seems like serendipity, maybe to some, but that serendipity got you to the place you are today. And the experiences that you had, I think, are ideal, that you better understand how business works at its core. Wouldn't you say?
I think the diversity, it's one of the things that when I look for talent,
Yeah.
skill sets to hire people to kind of like go into business deals with, I definitely don't see very many people that have wandered as broad of a path and experiences as I have had.
Yeah.
And I mean,
And at the time, it probably felt maybe frustrating.
horrific. Yeah. I mean,
But
it definitely did. But I think that to your point, the diversity of experiences and not, there's a cheating way of doing it where you go work at a place like Deloitte or McKinsey and
exactly.
you stay there for 20 years and you get exposure to a lot of different clients that have gone through a lot of different things, ups, downs, recessions, rapid growth, political strife, but you're all doing it under the safety and security of the McKinsey blanket where your job exists and you're just progressing throughout your career from level 1 to 2 to 3 and partner, and or Deloitte in the same manner.
Yes.
Having to sit there and bounce around to these other companies to geographically up and move, to be again opportunistic, or just get frustrated with the lack of opportunities in Colorado. I mean, there's a lot of people in Colorado that don't ever move. They're
Right.
just as frustrated as I am, or Texas or New York, and they hate New York. They have family there. They look at the people in Florida and say, "My God, I'd love a house like that for $300,000." And instead of my studio apartment that I pay $3,500 a month for and don't own. But it's just getting the gumption to actually do it. And I get that life gets in the way. I mean, you have
Yes.
kids, you have a wife, you have family obligations that some people still can truck on while having those things, and they kind of take them with them. But it does make it more complicated, and you know accordingly very few people do it,
Right.
and accordingly they kind of, I feel like, they're not going to view it this way because it's their life, but they get limited professionally in the experiences that they get exposure to, and they're just, I mean, they're going to play a role somewhere, but more likely than not they're just, probably they don't have the breadth of experiences and challenges at different companies, and having to like really adapt almost like a special agent that's going into like Iraq 1 week and Russia another week and Lithuania another. Like, you really have to be able to kind of read the company, read the business owners, understand things very quickly, and kind of put in place plans that you ruffle feathers. I mean, that is one thing I'm extremely good at, is
Right.
people like to believe that the way that they've structured things from a life perspective, personal perspective, professional, business owner perspective is the right way, and they want to get patted on the back. And when someone comes in and points out, like, better ways of doing things, or challenges of the existing system that those people may be aware of, but they kind of ignore or brush off. But if that's the problem that's preventing you from kind of moving ahead, you got to address it head on.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of like a tennis player trying to play through an injury. Like, I mean, sometimes it works, but if your elbow doesn't work, it's hard to hit the tennis ball.
That's right.
And so if they've got a core disability or challenge that within their business that they just don't want to remedy, whether it's like a son that runs, he's the COO, but he's really not very good and doesn't really want to be there. Like, that's a problem you got to fix.
Right.
And there's different ways to accomplish that, but ultimately you still have to resolve it and to have the business progress forward, and be able to know how to expand nationally, internationally, and kind of grow. So yeah, the experiences help.
Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time that we've done here today. But, I think that's important, but I think as we bring this to a close, that I want to better understand this dream you have for Green Valor Capital.
Sure.
I have a pretty good handle, but I'm not sure that our listeners do. So if you could kind of take a deeper dive in the final few minutes, then I think that would be helpful.
I mean, I'm probably much more of an entrepreneur at heart. I mean, I would rather be on the side where, of a Thomas Alva Edison or Nikolai Tesla
Yeah.
or an Elon Musk, where you're involved in constructing a new idea like a Steve Jobs, and kind of creating a product or a service or a retail store or something, and getting the support and capital and driving the operational growth of that idea and that business to kind of make the world a better place. Have flying cars, have a car that goes from here to the moon in like 5 minutes. I mean, it'd be pretty sweet to like have dinner on the moon and then come back home.
That's right.
But my experience in graduating with that physics degree, with kind of that background of, you can view it in a lot of ways as a bit of an engineering degree where you're steeped in much more of the theoretical and a lot less of the practical, but the skill set of trying to envision better products, better services, better ways of doing things from a telecom perspective or whatever it is. My personality is that I had a lot of great ideas, a lot of things that I wanted to pursue. And when I graduated, this was still a good time in the late 2000s. Like we were over a year away from the 01 downturn. So we weren't on the red hot of the 90s, growth cycle, but we were still on, all cylinders firing. And it was still really difficult in Colorado to even get close to capital. Even a little bit of seed capital, $5 grand, 10 grand, let alone the big numbers like 50, 100 grand or $1 million. And now, a few years earlier, all you needed was an idea and a business plan for like Blue Mountain Cards up in Boulder, that Polis came up with, and you got a $50
Great,
million
great
check.
example.
Yeah, I mean, it was easy as hell. So that was there at one point for a hot moment,
Right.
but it definitely was not there, kind of when I got through. And, I think that as I've progressed in a career, I continue to see that same lack of availability for either earlier stage entrepreneurs or existing small business owners that have had a business for 20, 30, 40, 50 years, and they're looking to take it to the next level. They've been at 50 million in sales for 10 years and they can't quite get to like 75 or 100 million. And they, if they had $1 million in additional injected capital, they'd be able to finally expand their product lines or expand their geographic locations and get to the next level. In a lot of ways, small businesses in New York do. I mean, there's a reason that you have a burger joint called Shake Shack that was founded there that is now like a publicly traded gigantic company. It got that initial support from investors on this side of the world because they were physically located there. I mean, it's not that it's a great burger joint. I don't think it's really any better than Five Guys, and I'll let burger people argue with their preferences, but it's the point that if you're in these other markets that aren't in San Francisco and New York, your ability to access capital to grow businesses is really challenged.
Yes.
And so as much as I'd like to be a business owner that like grows, these operational companies, in my life, the thing that I kind of see as being the deficiency that I guess I feel like I have to remedy is the fact there isn't a lot of capital available to these other people that are going to be like-minded to myself. And so having a business that focuses on providing that intermediary service that connects those businesses in these ancillary markets like Denver, Austin, Dallas, Tampa, Raleigh,
Right.
to the capital market, New York specifically, and at times San Francisco. I mean, granted, there's investors in other locations. I get it. There just isn't a lot of money in
Right.
other locations. So I think facilitating a path that capital can get injected into Colorado businesses, Texas businesses, and so forth. That's kind of the mission and vision, and I think that there's very little competition in it, and I would invite anyone that wants to challenge that to do so. But I just don't see a lot of people rushing to do this kind of work because of some of the challenges of working with small businesses, of the difficulty of getting capital into these markets. It is hard.
Right.
But I think it's also very possible, and we're going to have another generation that passes by where like great ideas die in the inventors' heads if you don't find a way to get capital. And, if you require people to go to San Francisco and New York, just give me a lot of people that can't do that in their life. So, so I think that's the idea behind Green Valor and kind of what its focus is.
Yeah, it is your why. Erik, I really appreciate the time you spent with me today. You are an extremely smart guy, well educated, great experiences, and I think that you have a bright future. And we'll get through COVID. COVID is it's a global problem that we're going to have for the foreseeable future, but there is an end to it, and so the opportunities will emerge again in 2021. So, any final comments you'd like to make before we wrap things up for today?
Thank you for the time to be able to chat and kind of get this out there. And I look forward to continuing to work with you.
Sounds great. Thanks for your time.
Take care.